Hello, dear listeners. Today we will transport ourselves to a place where time flows differently, to Japan. But not the Japan we know, not the City of Light, Tokyo, nor the stone pavilions of Kyoto. We will go far back, thousands of years, to the very origins, to where there were no temples yet, no samurai, no writing, only earth, sky, water, and the footsteps of the first people. It's hard to imagine now, but once upon a time, tens of thousands of years before all records, maps, and chronologies, Japan was not an island. It was part of the mainland. Its lands stretched from the Asian continent through forests and hills, connected to Korea and Siberia. Back then, in the late Paleolithic era, the climate was different. Harsh, cold, with ice descending from the north and winds penetrating every slope and valley. Approximately 40,000 years ago, people arrived here. Who they were, we don't know for sure, but they carried with them stone, fire, and the experience of movement. They crossed steppes, forests, and found here a land where they could settle. These people did not yet know pottery, did not cultivate rice, and did not build houses resembling those that would emerge millennia later. Their way of life was hunter-gatherer. They used stone tools, scrapers, arrowheads, axes, many of which are found today in Hokkaido and northern Honshu. They hunted prehistoric deer, wild boars, pheasants, and even Naumann's elephants, which inhabited the areas where modern Japanese cities now stand. Their dwellings were likely temporary, huts or earth shelters that were easy to abandon and rebuild. They lived in a world where everything was closer to the earth. Night fell with true darkness, food was obtained with effort. Death and life went hand in hand. Gradually, with the end of the Ice Age, the climate began to change. Approximately 12,000 years ago, sea levels rose, and the land bridges connecting Japan to the continent submerged. Thus, the archipelago took on its modern contours. This was a moment of geological separation and cultural birth. At the same time, the so-called Jomon period begins. The name comes from the clay vessels decorated with rope patterns. Jomon means rope pattern. It was then that the world's first culture emerged where people, not yet knowing metal, were already making pottery. They molded it by hand, fired it in open fires, and decorated it with ornaments that were sometimes whimsical and complex, like patterns on leaves or on the surface of water. Although the Jomon culture is often depicted as peaceful, archaeological data indicate the presence of violence and conflict between groups. Jomon settlements were small. Typically, these were communities of a few dozen people. People lived in semi-subterranean dwellings covered with grass or bark, built fires in the center of their homes, and led a seasonal lifestyle. They gathered nuts, acorns, fished in rivers and seas, and hunted small animals. They did not wage wars, did not build fortifications. Their world was established, stable, and probably quite peaceful. Over time, they began to cultivate plants, chestnuts, millet, legumes. Although rice was not yet the staple of their diet, a sense of dependence on the land, on the repeatability of cycles, was already emerging. Doge figurines, found throughout Japan, are a mystery of this era. Female figures with exaggerated forms, sometimes with strange features, as if they were images of spirits, aliens, or goddesses. They were placed in homes, buried in the ground, laid in graves. Were they guardians, or fertility symbols, or a bridge between the living and the departed? We don't know, but we know for sure that the Jomon world was spiritual. They believed in the forest, in the mountains, in the rain, in the smoke from the fire, in the rhythm of nature. One of the most striking archaeological discoveries related to the Jomon period was the excavated Sanai Maruyama settlement in the north of Honshu Island. Here, beneath layers of earth, a whole world was preserved. Remnants of wooden dwellings, storage pits, obsidian artifacts, shells and fishing gear, traces of a chestnut plantation. It was a kind of proto-city, astonishing in its scale. People lived here for centuries without leaving the place, and perhaps for the first time felt what it means to belong to a landscape. Jomon cultures were scattered throughout Japan. In the south, in Kyushu, they coexisted with a tropical climate and abundant fish. In the north, in Hokkaido, they adapted to cool forests and rocks. Over time, pottery became more complex. Early, vessels were simple, but later, forms close to sculpture appeared. Some vessels from the late Jomon period resemble flames, whirlwinds, cloud swirls. This was no longer just utilitarian pottery. It was a statement, perhaps ritualistic, perhaps related to burial or celebration. Archaeologists find footprints of children, fingerprints in the clay. A living hand left its mark in the cooling clay, as if time itself wanted to remain here in this form. The Jomon world lasted for millennia, and in this lies something astonishing: persistence. Not progress, not expansion, but precisely the ability to live in harmony with nature for centuries. It was a time when humanity could not be the master of nature, but a part of it. When death was not a tragedy, but the completion of a cycle. When rituals were not separated from everyday life. Everything happened gently, like the alternation of day and night. But one day, something changed. New people came to Japan. From the south, through Korea, settlers arrived, bringing with them a different way of life. They knew agriculture in the full sense of the word. They did not just gather fruits, they cultivated rice, drained swamps, built irrigation canals. They brought with them bronze and iron, new weapons, new ornaments, a different language, and a different social organization. Along with this came a new style of pottery, smooth, without ornament, with simple lines. Thus began the Yayoi era. This era is a turning point in Japanese history. If the Jomon culture was horizontal, based on equality and community, Yayoi brought the vertical, power, hierarchy, social differences. Communities became settlements. Settlements became fortified villages, with moats, palisades, and watchtowers. These were signs of instability, but also signs of nascent organization. The Yayoi people built granaries on stilts to protect the ET, harvest. They made bronze mirrors and dotaku bells, which may have been used in rituals to invoke rain or to thank spirits for the harvest. These bells were often buried in the ground, as if the connection to the divine came not from the sky, but from the soil itself. Along with bronze, iron also came to the country. It changed everything. Hoes, sickles, spears were made of iron. The land was worked faster. The harvest became more stable. Surpluses appeared, and with that, differences emerged between those who owned and those who worked. For the first time in Japan's history, relations of dominance and subordination began to form, with chiefs, clans, and titles. Archaeological findings from that time clearly show. Some lived in wooden houses with decorations and bronze, others in simple huts, with one bowl and a stone knife. This was an era when the first notions of statehood began to penetrate the territory of future Japan. Along with bronze came customs from China and Korea, the idea of writing, the concept of center and periphery, rituals of power. Chinese chronicles already begin to mention the Wa people, the Japanese. According to the Chinese Book of Later, Han, in the 1st century AD, there were about 100 independent small states in these lands. Some of them entered into contact with the Middle Kingdom. In one of the earliest diplomatic acts, dated to the 57th year, the Chinese emperor presents the ruler of the Japanese state of Na with a golden seal bearing the image of a snake dragon. This seal has been found and is still preserved today as evidence of the ancient connection. But among all these small principalities, one figure stands out particularly. Her name is shrouded in mystery. She was a woman who ruled the country of Yamatai. Her name was Himiko. Sources describe her as a priestess, a hermit, a ruler. She lived in a secluded residence, rarely showed herself to people, and ruled through rituals. It was said that thousands of women served her. The people obeyed her not out of fear, but out of conviction. Her reign was a time of order. She sent embassies to China, accepted titles, exchanged gifts, and even if part of this story is a legend, the fact remains. For the first time in Japanese history, the image of a centralized power appears. This era, spanning roughly from 300 BC to 300 AD, concludes the prehistoric phase. The world was changing. The land was no longer just a provider. It became the basis of power. People lived less and less in caves, more and more often behind fences. Less and less listened to the forest. More and more listened to those who stood higher. Over time, Yayoi communities continued to grow, and with that, the need for structure increased. The more villages there were, the harder it became to maintain order without leadership. Thus, alliances, coalitions of settlements, led by the most respected chiefs, began to emerge. These chiefs no longer just managed the economy. They also possessed symbolic power, relying on myths, rituals, and heritage. At the same time, clan structures, or uji, formed, associations of people connected not only by origin, but also by common cults, common land, and common memory. Beginning in the 4th century AD, the era known as Kofun commences. This word means ancient burial mounds and refers to the astonishingly large and shaped tombs that appeared throughout Japan. Particularly characteristic are the so-called keyhole-shaped mounds, gigantic earthen structures, hundreds of meters long, surrounded by moats, artificial islands, built with incredible precision. These mounds were the burial places of chiefs, and, likely, the first rulers. They were located in regions where the core of the Japanese state would later form, in the Yamato Plain. The mounds themselves spoke volumes. Here is the center. Here is the one who governs not only the living, but also the dead. Here is a place of memory, where the earth itself transforms into a symbol of power. Around these mounds were placed Haniwa figures, terracotta statues of warriors, animals, buildings. Perhaps they served as guardians, perhaps they reflected the life the deceased had left, or perhaps they were part of a ritual connecting the living and the departed. With the expansion of such burial mounds across the archipelago, one can also trace the growth of influence of one of the early political centers, the Yamato state. This was not a state in the modern sense, but it was already an alliance of clans with a clear hierarchy, a center of power, a political core. The Yamato chief, called Okimi, gradually became a sacred figure. His clan began to assert its descent from the sun goddess Amaterasu. This was not just a myth. It was a justification for the right to power, linking heaven and earth, ritual and governance. The Uji-Kabani system of clan titles and ranks became the foundation of early Japanese feudal organization. Each clan had its place, its function, and its rank. Power spread not through laws, but through ritual, obligation, reverence. Politics was woven into the clan structure, into ancestral rites, into seasonal festivals, into gifts, and into temples. The state was born from memory, not from treaties. Simultaneously, cultural and technological exchange with the mainland continued. Through Korea, ideas of Chinese statehood, writing, and ritual penetrated Japan. Korean immigrants, artisans, builders, musicians settled in Yamato, bringing new knowledge, bronze casting, written characters, Confucian norms. All of this was gradually woven into the Japanese fabric, not destroying it, but enriching it and transforming it from within. Japanese military expeditions to the Korean peninsula, especially in the 5th century, testify to the growing desire to solidify their influence outside the archipelago. According to Chinese and Korean chronicles, Yamato possessed several enclaves in the south of the peninsula, particularly in the Baekje and Silla regions. These contacts were not stable, but they underscored a new position. Japan was no longer an isolated island. It was becoming an actor in East Asian politics. And yet, deep within this change, something old remained. People continued to cultivate the land, harvest, and make offerings to the local spirits. Water remained sacred. Stone alive. The path from dwelling to grave did not follow a line, but a circle. And perhaps it was precisely this combination, new and old, brought and born, power and ritual, that formed the basis for what would later become the Japanese state. Gradually, Yamato's power solidified. Against the backdrop of many small chiefs who ruled separately, the Yamato family gradually subdued regions, not so much by force as by connections, marriages, exchanges, gifts, and the acceptance of their sacred status. The image of Amaterasu, the sun goddess, became the central element of the ideology of power. Around the sun cult, not just a religion, but a political conception was formed. If the ruler is a descendant of heavenly light, then the entire country is his continuation. The center of this world was located in the area of modern Nara. Temples, residences, and burial mounds were built there. Rulers adopted titles derived from Chinese tradition, but adapted them to Japanese sensibility. They sent embassies to the Middle Kingdom, and the most famous of these, in the 7th century, was signed with a letter from the ruler of the land of the rising sun to the ruler of the land of the setting sun. This was a declaration of equality, audacious but confident. Japan was beginning to recognize itself not as a periphery, but as a world with its own axis. The establishment of a centralized state proceeded in parallel with the development of ritual practices enshrined in temples and temple architecture. The Ise shrine, dedicated to the sun goddess, became not only a cultic, but also a symbolic center of the country. Its appearance was simple: austere wooden beams, a thatched roof, no decorative splendor. But therein lies the essence of Japanese aesthetics. The quieter the form, the stronger the presence. The shrine was dismantled and rebuilt every 20 years, not because of destruction, but as a ritual of renewal, preserving the purity of the design. This repetition, like the breath of history, amidst the refined rituals and the still fragile political structure, what makes history real continued. The lives of the people. They cultivated rice, which now became not just a product, but a measure of time. An agricultural calendar began with festivals, rituals, harvest seasons. Fishermen went out to sea in boats built according to ancient designs. Women wove clothes, men built houses, children played by ponds, listening to elders' stories about spirits and shadows, and all this in the shadow of the burial mounds where the ancestors rested. Each settlement had its own hill of memory, its own history, told, without writing but passed down by voice. And it was then, towards the end of the 5th century, that what would change everything arrived in the country. Writing, first through China, then through Korea, with gifts, with mirrors, with books. These books held a new dimension, the IVE permanence of the word. From now on, history ceased to be merely a voice. It became a line. The Japanese began to learn. Officials from Yamato began to master the Chinese language, copy Buddhist sutras, write down laws, describe dynasties. These first records were not yet Japanese in spirit, but the character already resonated within them. Thus, a culture was born where the word was not just the transmission of thought, but a sacred act. From this lineage would emerge the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, the first Japanese chronicles describing the world of gods, emperors, and the land created with a spear. By this time, in the 6th century, a new faith also arrived, Buddhism. First as a political gift, then as a cultural shock, it entered Japan and did not displace the old beliefs, but came to live alongside them. Shinto and Buddhism began to grow together, like the roots of two trees intertwined in the same earth. Thus, the country where there was no writing, where the forest was the greatest wisdom, traversed a path over millennia to speak of itself to the world. And at this point, we pause. Ahead lies the formation of the state, the Shotoku era, the first temples, and the first books. But for now, let's linger here. Feel the silence of the Yamato Plains. Imagine the burial mound under the starry sky. And among the grasses, among the crickets, one can hear. The earth remembers. With the advent of the 6th century, the landscape of Japan was already changing. Where there were once burial mounds and villages, the first stone foundations of new types of buildings began to appear. More and more often, names resonated that remained in history not as shadows, but as nodes. One such node is the name of a prince said to be the creator of Japan, as we know it today. His name was Umayado, but in history he remained as Shotoku Taishi, regent under Empress Suiko, grandson of the legendary Emperor Keitai, a man who united political will, Buddhist thought, and the Chinese system of government in a single breath of the era. Prince Shotoku did not merely rule, he contemplated. His reign began in the year 593. He saw how China flourished under the Sui dynasty, how Confucian discipline was combined with Buddhist compassion, how officialdom became the foundation of stability. And he understood. For Japan not to remain fragmented, clan-bound, and shaky, it needed order, not as coercion, but as an inner measure. Shotoku became the author of a document called Japan's First Constitution, though it is more of a code. 17 articles, written in the year 604, became not a legal law, but a spiritual instruction. In these lines, respect for harmony, emphasis on justice, mention of Buddha as a support, Confucian morality, Buddhist virtue, and local family loyalty merged into a single text. Shotoku did not limit himself to words. He sent the first Japanese embassy to China, and this was not merely a diplomatic decision. It was a declaration. Japan is not a tributary, but a partner. The message to the Chinese emperor began with a phrase that was received with surprise in the Middle Kingdom. From the ruler of the land of the rising sun to the ruler of the land of the setting sun. This line sounded like a challenge, like independence, like the birth of self-awareness. Shotoku built temples. The most significant were Horyuji and Shitennoji. The first is preserved to this day. Its centuries-old wooden beams carry the scent of incense, the sound of the wind, and a hushed prayer. This was not merely an act of faith. It was a touch of architecture as a state of mind. Buddhism, officially adopted, became not only a religion, but a new optic in which the ruler saw himself not as a master, but as a servant of harmony. Buddhism penetrated not only into temples, but also into consciousness. Monks, philosophers, calligraphy masters, and sutra translators began to arrive. Schools emerged in monasteries. Texts began to be copied. Writing, based on Chinese characters, adapted to the Japanese language. This was not a rapid process, but it laid the foundation for future literature, chronicles, and poetry. Alongside the prince were people whose names have been preserved. Oe no Uji, Umakai, representatives of clans, who integrated into the reform. They understood. For the country to become more than a clan structure, old privileges had to be abandoned. And that is precisely why, shortly after Shotoku, the Great Renewal began, which would receive the name Taika. In the mid-7th century, in the year 645, a coup occurred. The Soga clan, influential but increasingly authoritarian, lost power. Prince Naka no Oi and Nakatomi no Kamatari carried out a palace coup. Soga fell. A new period began, the Taika reforms, meaning Great Transformation. Emperor Kotoku, formally on the throne, became a figure in whose name the reformers reshaped the entire system of governance in the country. All land was declared imperial property. Provinces received new appointed administrators. The Ritsuryo system was introduced, a state administration modeled on the Chinese, where every social stratum, every unit of land, every duty was recorded in writing. This was not merely imitation, it was adaptation. Japan did not lose its spiritual essence, but absorbed external forms to find stability. The Taika reforms became the root from which the early Japanese state would grow. The land no longer belonged to individual clans. It became the property of the center. Peasants were obliged to pay taxes not to a specific chief, but to the state. This was a turning point, from personal dependence to an administrative system. Officials were sent to the north and west of the country to conduct censuses. Measurements, accounting, registration began. A process that was itself a sign of a new era, the era of paper order. Imperial courts began to move in search of a suitable location. But by the 8th century, the choice fell on an area that would be called Heijō-kyo. We know it as Nara. This was the first permanent capital. It was built according to a strict plan, inspired by the Chinese capital Chang'an. Straight streets, quarters divided into sections, the main palace on the northern axis, temples, markets, residential areas. In this city, everything was like in a morning ritual, precise, directed, ordered. Nara was not just a political center. It became a space where Buddhism and the idea of the state finally merged. The greatest symbol of this unity was the Todai-ji Monastery, the main temple of the empire, where the great Buddha sat enthroned, cast in bronze, majestic, thoughtful, introverted. The height of the statue is over 15 meters, but its power is not in its size. It is in its presence. To cast it, bronze from all over the country was needed, the efforts of thousands of workers, and a ritual in which everyone participated, from the emperor to the last peasant. Buddha became not just an object of worship, he became a state entity, the embodiment of law and compassion at the same time. In Nara, the Ritsuryo was introduced, an official code that included criminal and administrative law. It covered everyday life, from the management of temples to the regulation of officials' clothing. Titles, ranks, order of appointment, and salary sizes were established. An examination system based on Confucian canons was introduced, although it never had as much significance in Japan as in China. Nevertheless, more and more officials came not by birth, but by knowledge. Albeit slowly, a movement began. Buddhism flourished during these years. Different schools vied for influence. Hosso, Kegon, Sanron. Monasteries received land, wealth, and support from the imperial court. Monks became advisors, sometimes even political figures. Temples, not just places of prayer, but also political centers. This created tensions that would later lead to a desire to free themselves from their influence. And yet, despite all the formalities, Nara's heart beat to the rhythm of aesthetics. It was during this period that the first chronicles were compiled, Kojiki and Nihon Shoki. The first, a sacred book of memory, written for internal use, contains myths, legends, genealogies, the birth of the world, Amaterasu, Susanoo, the great campaigns of the first emperors. The second, more systematic, intended to present Japanese history in a diplomatic context. In both texts, history becomes not only a narrative, but the foundation of legitimacy. In them, the past is not just time, but the reason for the present. From the same spirit also sprang the first collection of poetry in Japan's history, Manyoshu. This was not just a collection of poems, it was a mirror of the people. Here resonated the voices of emperors and peasants, lovers and warriors, monks and fishermen. One thing united them, the desire to express feeling. In this poetry, no philosophy, but a state. No logic, but a sound. And in this, the most Japanese note. A word that does not explain, but is present. However, behind the beauty and order, there were also cracks. The growing influence of Buddhist monasteries began to cause concern. Many of them became warlords, armed themselves, built their own troops, and influenced the imperial family. Alongside prayer, control appeared. The emperors felt this pressure. Therefore, at the end of the 8th century, Emperor Kamu made a decision that would mark the beginning of a new era: to move the capital. He chose a new place, further north. The area was called Uda, and a city would be built there, which would be named Heian-kyo, the capital of peace and tranquility. We know it as Kyoto. Here, the next century of Japanese history would unfold. Refined, aristocratic, misty, and filled with the sounds of flutes. With the relocation of the capital to Heian-kyo, a new era began. It was not just a geographical gesture. It was a movement inward. The city of Heian, which would later become Kyoto, was built according to rules, but lived by intuition. Here, a shogun was out of place. Here reigned silence, writing, the movement of the fan. Emperor Kamu moved the court here in the year 794. He wanted to escape the influence of the monasteries, the cumbersome structure of the Nara court. He sought a new beginning, closer to the spirit of the mountains, away from the monastic hand. Heian was built as an ideal city. Its streets intersected strictly at right angles. The central axis led to the palace, from which power radiated, like light. Around it were the houses of courtiers, gardens, temples, pagodas. But behind this form, something else was born. Not an administrative order, but a culture of contemplation. In the capital, where everything was arranged according to rules, feelings, on the contrary, began to flow freely. Here, another language of power was born, the language of the sign, the aroma, the hint, the gesture. The emperors of this era were often young poets at heart. They ruled less and less, more and more formally. True power passed to the Fujiwara clan. They did not stage coups, they married. They married their daughters to emperors, and their grandchildren became new monarchs. Thus, the clan that did not possess a throne came to rule from within the throne, elegantly, silently, without bloodshed. It was an aristocracy of intrigue, but also of aesthetics. Heian culture was a culture of feeling. Courtiers wore clothes of dozens of silk layers, their color changing with the seasons. Women wrote diaries, men composed poetry. Politeness and emotion were not opposites, but forms of existence. Language transformed into refined music, each word into a mood. The rank system determined who could speak to whom, but poetry was universal. courtiers exchanged poems, like breath, 3 lines and a whole life. The most outstanding work of this era was The Tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu. It was the world's first psychological novel, created at the beginning of the ED 11th century. It tells of a brilliant prince, his love, his sufferings, his path. But behind the plot lies more. It is a poem about transience, about how everything passes, how beauty does not last, how a scent disappears after the rain. In this novel, all of Heian, restless, sad, elegant. On the other hand, the prose of women's diaries developed. Sei Shonagon, a contemporary of Murasaki, wrote The Pillow Book, observations, capricious, witty, lively. In these lines, a woman's view of the world, of men, of autumn, of the smell of smoke. The female voice in Heian became not an ornament, but a gaze, sharp, precise, free. Meanwhile, beyond the capital, another world existed, a world of provinces, peasants, warriors. Imperial power penetrated there more and more weakly. Local clans strengthened their lands, formed armed detachments. Among them, families began to stand out that would later become the core of Japanese history. Taira, Minamoto, Fujiwara, no Hidesada, and his descendants. They accumulated strength while the capital spun silk letters. Formally, the country was united, but in fact, its duality began. In the center, aesthetics, aristocracy, flute, poem. On the fringes, earth, blade, duty, service. These two worlds had not yet collided, but they were already looking in different directions. One into the clouds, the other to the horizon. In this gap lies the germ of the future samurai era. But, for now, the night still belonged to poems. Irises bloomed over the ponds. The scent of incense drifted through the palace. And in the garden, among the stones, lay an open scroll, and on it, 3 lines about moonlight on the water. While flutes continued to sound in Kyoto and courtiers debated the nuances of brocade and the rhythm of poems, changes were taking place outside the capital that slowly but inexorably altered the very structure of the country. The imperial court, sinking deeper and deeper into aesthetic contemplation, lost connection with the lands from which rice, taxes, and people came. The administration of the provinces passed from officials to local clans, increasingly military in nature. These clans, having first gained the right to collect taxes, then to lead private armed detachments, began to feel themselves full masters of their territories. They did not need to wait for instructions from Kyoto. They became independent, first de facto, then de jure. Thus, a new social stratum gradually formed, the Bushi, the warriors. The word samurai comes from the verb saburao, to serve. But service here meant not servility, but loyalty. Loyalty to the Lord, to the land, to the clan, to memory. Samurai were not just soldiers. They were bearers of a new ethic. Determination, restraint, contempt for death, and deep respect for duty. Their lives were not divided into combat and everyday life. There was only one life, in a state of readiness. By the end of the 11th century, 2 powerful clans stood out. Taira, and Minamoto. They originated from junior branches of the imperial family, but had long since become independent forces. The Taira were famous at sea, close to the court, and actively used maritime trade. The Minamoto, on the other hand, relied on the provincial nobility, were strong on land, their troops forming the basis of the defense of the northern and eastern regions. Their confrontation was not immediate. It matured slowly, like a thunderstorm, accumulating silent tension. The emperors, losing power, sought ways to escape the control of the Fujiwara clan, which effectively governed the country. Then they began the practice of Insei, abdication from the throne while retaining real rule. Former emperors, called In, established their palaces, their administration, their close associates. Sometimes they ruled from behind the scenes for decades, entering into conflicts with the reigning monarchs and their regents. This gave rise to a complex political mosaic in which each figure, the reigning emperor, the abdicated one, the Fujiwara clan, the Taira, and Minamoto clans, had its own interests and ambitions. By the end of the 11th century, Insei reached its peak. The abdicated Emperor Shirakawa retained power for decades, despite being a monk. His court became the second decision-making center. This blurred the structure. The more centers there were, the more unstable the balance became. Taira Kiyomori, the head of the Taira clan, was the first to take advantage of this situation. He rose from a provincial commander to a grand state councilor. By marrying his daughters to the emperor, he made his grandson, Emperor Antoku, the figure of his power. The Taira rule was brilliant: construction, reforms, seafaring, diplomacy, with Song China. But it aroused hatred. The capital whispered, the provinces seethed. The Minamoto, previously defeated, rose again. The uprising began with a few skirmishes. It quickly became a popular movement. Peasant associations, samurai, disgruntled officials, all united against the Taira. The Minamoto clan, under the leadership of Minamoto no Yoritomo, began to raise an army. He did not rush to Kyoto. He built a base in Kamakura, on the eastern coast, far from the center, but closer to the future. Here, a new power was founded. Not of the court, but of a military camp. Not of ritual, but of oath. While Yoritomo consolidated his power, his younger brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, led the army. He was a brilliant tactician. Under his command, the Minamoto forces achieved victory after victory. The climax was the naval battle of Danura in 1185. There, in the Shimonoseki Strait, in the foaming waves, the Taira clan suffered its final defeat. The young Emperor Antoku, still a child, was drowned along with the regalia: sword, mirror, precious gem. The Taira sank into the water, and with them, an entire era sank. But the Minamoto victory did not become the triumph of the empire. It became the birth of another model of power. Yoritomo did not return to Kyoto. He remained in Kamakura and there founded the shogunate, a military dictatorship in which the emperor formally retained his status, but all real power belonged to the shogun. This was a new stage. Japan became dual. Kyoto, the spiritual heart. Kamakura, the willful center. From this moment on, and for several centuries, power would belong not to the clan, but to the sword. In Kamakura, at the foot of green hills, where paths wind among pines, and the sea breathes at the foot of cliffs, a new power was established. Here, no flutes sounded. Here, no 40 layers of silk were worn. Here, they wrote on wooden tablets, discussed vassals' stipends, and built a structure where everyone knew whom they served and for what they were responsible. Yoritomo, who became the first shogun in 1192, understood stability is impossible without a system. He did not abolish the emperor, but he ensured that the emperor remained in the shadows. Decisions were made in Kamakura and passed down as orders. This was not a state in the traditional sense. It was an order based on service and personal loyalty. Yoritomo introduced the system of Shisho and Jito, officials appointed by the shogunate in the provinces. Some collected taxes, others maintained order. Samurai now had the right to land, but not as owners, but as holders conditional on service. They received income from specific landholdings and were obliged to appear when summoned. This was the germ of feudalism, but with a Japanese specificity. Land was not separated from service, and honor was above possession. The Kamakura shogunate was not based on architecture. It was based on a contract. Quiet, internal, not always written, but deeply rooted. The Bushi Code was not yet formulated as a philosophy, but it was already felt as a way of life. A samurai was obliged to die honorably, but not obliged to win at any cost. He was to be just, not to strive for wealth, not to fear suffering. It was a path of restraint, in which the blade was an extension of will, not malice. At the same time, a new spiritual turning point began in Japan. New schools of Buddhism penetrated the country. The most significant became Zen and Amidism. Zen came from China, from the Chan school, and quickly found resonance among warriors. Its essence, in silence, in contemplation, in direct turning, to the nature of the mind without reference to scriptures. Zen monks lived simply, in cells, among stones, in labor. They did not argue. They did not teach systematically. They simply showed. A cup, a stone, an empty wall. Samurai perceived Zen as their mirror. In it there was no mercy, but there was calm. Meditation helped to see death without fear. In Zen monasteries, concentration, endurance, and discipline began to be trained. Many samurai retired there after their service. There, in silence, they sought not salvation, but purification. Every breath was a sword, every movement like a line in the snow. In parallel, the Pure Land School flourished. Its foundation, faith in Amida, the Buddha of infinite light, and the repetition of his name as an act of trust. Simple people were drawn to this faith. It required no erudition, only the heart, only Namu Amida Butsu. Repeat and trust. In this sound, as in the breath of a wave, hope was born. But while spiritual life deepened, an external threat approached. From across the sea, from the continent, a new power arose. The Mongols. Having unified China, they expanded their empire. And one day, they turned their gaze to Japan. The first raid occurred in 1274. Warriors of the Yuan dynasty landed on the coast of Kyushu. They had Chinese and Korean allies, metal armor, catapults, fire arrows. The Japanese, armed in an old-fashioned way, fought bravely, but were outnumbered. However, a sudden typhoon ended the invasion. The fleet was shattered. The wind, coming from the sea, saved Japan. It was called kamikaze, divine wind. A few years later, in 1281, the Mongols returned, and again a storm, again water. Stronger than the sword, the invasion failed, and Japan remained independent. But the victory proved bitter. Unlike traditional wars, there were no conquests, no trophies, and the samurai who had participated in the battles expected rewards. They received no land. This created tension. Loyalty began to waver. The economy weakened. The shogunate lost authority. Shortly after Yoritomo's death, power passed to the Hojo clan, his female line. They formed a regency, ruling in the name of the shoguns and transforming the title into a symbol. But power left Kamakura. Unrest brewed. The warriors felt order had become stagnation. Calm, the beginning of decay. When order wanes, the space fills with voices. In the early 14th century, Japan entered a period of uncertainty. The Kamakura shogunate still existed, but it trembled under its own weight. Financial resources dwindled. Samurai claims were ignored. Peasant debts grew. Unrest, not a rebellion, but no longer peace either. Against this backdrop, a figure appeared who believed imperial power must be restored. His name was Go-Daigo. He was from a lineage accustomed to ceremonies, but he possessed determination. Emperor Go-Daigo did not agree to the role of a symbol. He intended to regain control of the country. His attempt was bold, but unsuccessful. The shogunate sent him into exile. However, a year later, he escaped, gathered supporters, and raised the provinces. And here the turning point began. One of the generals sent to suppress the uprising switched to his side. His name was Ashikaga Takauji. Takauji, a descendant of the Minamoto, a charismatic and flexible man, overthrew Kamakura and helped Go-Daigo return. In Kyoto, the Kenmu Restoration began. The emperor ruled again, but only for a short time. Go-Daigo was an idealist. He aspired to the order of antiquity. His reforms did not meet the expectations of the warriors. Takauji was disappointed, turned away, and in 1336 established a new order. He installed another emperor and became shogun. The Ashikaga shogunate began, also called Muromachi, after the district in Kyoto where power was based. This rule was more refined, less strict, but also less stable. The Ashikaga created a new capital, supported the arts, promoted the tea ceremony, and contributed to the development of Zen Buddhism. This was an era when the monk Sesshu painted landscapes with ink, where white space said more than the line, where tatami became the unity of space and thought, where a garden of stones and moss reflected the world more precisely than a map. And yet, the Ashikaga shogunate did not hold the provinces. In reality, power was diluted. Disintegration began. Formally, emperor and shogun. Practically, clans that ruled independently. In the mid-15th century, the Onin War broke out. It lasted 10 years, destroyed Kyoto, burned temples, crushed centers. From this moment, the country entered an era that would be called Sengoku, the era of warring provinces. Japan became a multitude of castles, each with its own ruler. Clans fought for land, for rice, for mountains and passes. In this chaos, new forms of power emerged, not by origin, but by strength. Warriors did not wait for orders, they acted. The intelligent and resolute rose. The weak disappeared. Samurai became not only swordsmen, but also administrators, strategists, architects. They built castles with labyrinthine approaches, developed agriculture, formed tax systems. The type of daimyo emerged, the great feudal lord, who might have been a peasant yesterday. But if he won, his clan was now the ruling one. It was an era of terror and energy. Wars, raids, clan changes, betrayals, alliances, but also building, art, music. People lived in uncertainty, but they created in the rhythm of fate. And in this rhythm, three would soon appear. Three names that would put an end to the chaos. They are still unknown, but they are already being born in the depths of the provinces. Oda, Toyotomi, Tokugawa. But for now, the country is a network of roads, smoking fortresses, and shadows gliding over terraced rice fields. History takes a deep breath before the next step. Against a backdrop of ash and blood, amidst charred walls and burning rice fields, three figures emerge. They are different in origin, character, and path. But one thing unites them: the desire to end the century of chaos. The first of them is Oda Nobunaga. He comes from the central province of Owari, a clan not the strongest, but with an ancient name. In his youth, he is considered strange. He wears flashy clothes, ignores ceremonies, speaks boldly. But it is precisely this man who will begin the unification of Japan. His path, swift and merciless. Nobunaga understood that the old methods of warfare were outdated. He was the first to actively use firearms, arquebuses purchased from the Portuguese. He lined up infantry in ranks, organized volleys. He destroyed enemy castles and monasteries that had become military fortresses. In 1568, he captured Kyoto. In 1573, he overthrew the shogun. He did not take the throne, but became the master. Under him, reforms began: tax regulation, land redistribution, limitation of the power of Buddhist orders. He promoted trade, built roads, invited Europeans. But his cruelty and contempt for traditions created enemies for him. In 1582, Nobunaga died, betrayed by his vassal Akechi Mitsuhide. His death, sudden. His work was continued. The second unifier, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He came from peasant circles. He was called the Monkey because of his appearance. But he was a genius of maneuver, diplomacy, intuition. He avenged Nobunaga, defeated Akechi, subdued the remaining clans. He completed the unification of the country in 1591. Hideyoshi established a system where power depended not on origin, but on loyalty. He forbade peasants from carrying weapons, conducted a census, and fortified castles. His power was absolute, but he did not become shogun. Due to his origin, he could not. He took the title of Kampaku, regent. In him, cruelty and grace were combined. He built the Golden Castle in Osaka, developed theaters, and patronized culture. But in his last years, his dreams extended beyond Japan. He began the invasion of Korea. The campaign ended in disaster, and soon he died, leaving a minor son. A struggle for the inheritance begins. On this stage appears the third unifier, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a descendant of an old lineage, cautious, patient, capable of waiting. He built alliances, observed his opponents, and won the decisive Battle of Sekigahara in 1600. 3 years later, he received the title of shogun. He moved the center of power to Edo, the future Tokyo. He established an order that would last for over 2.5 centuries. With the victory of Tokugawa, the era of samurai ascendancy ended. Swords no longer needed blood. Warriors became bureaucrats, guardians of peace. The entire country transformed into a network of clans under a unified structure. But behind this calm stood the shadow of those who went to the end, those who sought not glory, but order. On the mountains, the wind still rustles. In the tea houses, on the shelves, there are scrolls with 3 lines. Dust settles on the armor, but within it, silence. To the east, amidst sun-drenched plains where the land gently slopes down to the bay shore, a city began to grow. Edo, the place chosen by Tokugawa Ieyasu to become the center of the new power. It was not beautiful, not ancient, but therein lay its advantage. The city could be built from scratch, as order demanded. After centuries of discord, movements, battles, silence finally returned. It was not natural. It was constructed. The old Tokugawa shogunate, founded in 1603, became the new architecture of the Japanese world. Ieyasu understood that peace could not be left to chance. He created a vertical power structure in which everyone knew their place. At the top was the shogun, but not as a military leader, but as an administrator, as an arbiter. The emperor remained in Kyoto. He was sacred, but without power. Henceforth, the entire system was divided into domains, han, each belonging to a daimyo. But the daimyo were no longer independent. They were obliged to serve. They had to live alternately in Edo and at home. Their families remained in the capital as hostages of peace. This was the Sankin Kotai system. Its rhythm, like the breath of the state, a year in Edo, a year at home. Processions moved along the roads, caravans 1,000 kilometers long, adorned with banners and servants, and every step an expression of submission. The wearing of weapons was permitted only to samurai. Peasants had to remain on the land, merchants in the cities, artisans in guilds. It was a class-based society, immobile. But in this immobility, stability. The land was resurveyed, taxes were fixed, rituals were ordered. For the first time in centuries, the country ceased to tremble. People lived, were born, died, according to a known rhythm. The shogunate did not build new borders. It built an inner framework. Gradually, Edo grew into a gigantic city. Over 1 million people, lived there. It was one of the largest cities in the world. Its streets were straight. Its quarters were clearly zoned. There was no random movement. Everyone knew their place. In the merchant quarters, shops, tea houses, print shops. In the samurai quarters, houses, weapons depots, calligraphy, schools. In the Yanaka district, quiet streets, monasteries, gardens. The air was filled with the smell of wood, tea, and damp moss. Edo culture is a culture of restraint. Here, brilliance is not valued. Here, form is important. How you enter a house, how you brew tea, how you present a letter, in all this, the inner rhythm of a person is revealed. The tea ceremony, not just a ritual. It is a point of calm, a space where words become superfluous and movement transparent. A rock garden where each pebble is placed with deliberate randomness reflects not the outer landscape, but the inner state. Here, the aesthetic of wabi-sabi was born, the beauty of the imperfect, the ephemeral, the unfinished. At the same time, what can be called Japan's first mass culture began. In entertainment districts, such as Yoshiwara, theater, poetry, and woodblock printing developed. Kabuki, the theater of passions, masks, and gestures, attracted crowds. Men played female roles, scenes repeated well-known stories, and every gesture was perfected. Bunraku, puppet theater, captivated the soul with the movement of a wooden figure. Here, the drama concentrated in the puppeteer's fingers, in the narrator's voice, in the beat of the drum. Alongside, ukiyo-e flourished, the art of woodblock prints. Pictures of the floating world depicted not eternity, but the moment. An actor, a woman in a kimono, a bird on a branch, a bridge in the rain. This art made everyday life an object of contemplation. It was mass-produced, sold cheaply, and decorated homes. In it, all of Edo Japan, concrete, vibrant, and disappearing, like incense smoke. Life flowed smoothly. Samurai served without war. They became officials. They learned, read, wrote. Their code, Bushido, became not military, but moral. It demanded not victory, but dignity. Peasants lived off the land, despite taxes. Merchants, though low in status, grew rich. Their houses became more luxurious. But status did not change. It was a society not of wealth, but of origin. And yet, beneath the surface, tension matured. Aging samurai, hungry peasants, enriched merchants. Everything was still calm. But in the calm, a premonition already resonated. Under the veil of order, beneath layers of bureaucratic control and class division, life continued. Slow, like a teapot on glowing coals. Rhythmic, like the creak of floorboards in a wooden house. Edo period Japan knew no wars. This was the first century in which a generation could live without a weapon in hand. People were born, married, died, all within the confines of one province, one temple, one gaze. This world was internal. It did not need conquests. It created space within itself. In the cities, daily life continued to develop. Artisans passed down their knowledge from generation to generation. Potters in Kyushu molded porcelain as delicate as a cloud. Carpentry workshops in Kyoto created furniture without a single nail. Weavers in Nishijin hand-wove patterns in which one could read the seasons. Everything was made not for the market, but as a service to form. The act of creation itself was sacred. It did not depend on demand. It depended on the master's breath. In the kitchens, cooking was done with respect for seasonality. In winter, miso soups, root vegetables, fried fish. In spring, young shoots, rice with greens. Summer brought cucumbers and soba noodles, chilled and served with soy sauce. In autumn, mushrooms, sweet potatoes, chestnuts. Food was not just food. It was a way of living in harmony with nature, of feeling that you were part of the cycle, not its master. In the temples, as before, the bells rang. Buddhism lived in everyday life, not as a doctrine, but as a habit of the heart. People visited Zen temples, sat in silence, looked at the wall. Where there were no images, the form of the mind began. In the Pure Land temples, the Amida mantra was repeated, hoping for rebirth. In Shinto shrines, harvests were celebrated, purification rituals performed, rice cakes lifted, offerings laid. All of this was not religion as a system. It was the fabric of everyday life, custom like breath. Poets wrote haikus, 3 lines, 17 syllables, but everything could fit in them. Dew on a leaf, the cry of a heron, the moon over the field. Basho, the greatest among them, wandered through the country. His path became not only a physical but also a spiritual journey. He recorded not events, but impressions. In his lines there was no morality, but a vision, clear as ice water. All of this occurred in a country almost completely isolated from the outside world. In the early 17th century, the Tokugawa shogunate issued a series of edicts known as the Sakoku policy. Closed country. Japan almost completely ceased foreign trade. Christianity, introduced by the Portuguese and Spanish, was banned. Missionaries were expelled. Japanese who had converted, executed, or forced into hiding. Trade was allowed only in one place, on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki, through the Dutch and Chinese. The rest of the world was excluded. This gesture of isolation was not out of fear, but out of a desire to preserve stability. The shogunate feared that other ideas would dissolve the fabric of power. It chose the path of protection at the cost of isolation. And in this isolation, the country created an entire universe within itself. But even in isolation, the world still seeped through the cracks. Through smuggled Dutch books, the Japanese began to study anatomy, mathematics, and astronomy. This movement was called Rangaku, Dutch learning. Scholars dissected bodies to study the internal organs, translated treatises, and sought knowledge, without destroying traditions. It was reason without revolution. Nevertheless, stability gradually became stagnation. The economy slowed down. Samurai became impoverished. They could not engage in trade, and their salaries remained the same. Merchants, on the other hand, grew richer and richer. A gap emerged between status and real situation. Those higher in the hierarchy became dependent on those considered lower. This created internal tension. Numerous reforms attempted to stabilize the system, limit luxury, promote frugality, and return to the spirit of antiquity. but they could not stop the flow of time. In the provinces, peasant unrest occurred. In the cities, outbreaks of discontent. These were not rebellions. These were signals. The balance had become too immobile. The wind of change was not yet blowing, but the air was becoming dense. History was approaching the moment when black ships would appear in the harbor, and the world, preserved for 2.5 centuries, would suddenly shatter. The year 1853. On the horizon of Edo Bay, something appeared that no one had seen for centuries. The silhouettes of ships with smokestacks, dark hulls, high mainsails. They brought something different. They were called black ships. These were American warships under the command of Commodore Matthew Perry. He arrived with a letter from the President of the United States, polite but insistent. The letter demanded the opening of ports for trade, the guarantee of safety for sailors, and the foresight of future cooperation. In his intention, he was calm, but his ships spoke louder than any words. It was the voice of a new world. The shogunate faced a choice for which it was unprepared. Debates lasted for months. To open up meant to break the centuries-old order. To refuse meant to challenge a power about which they had only fragmented information. When Perry returned a year later with an even larger fleet, the answer was given. Japan agreed. The Treaty of Kanagawa was signed. The ports of Shimoda and Hakodate were opened to American ships. This was followed by new agreements with Britain, the Netherlands, and Russia. Soon, Japan could no longer maintain its former equilibrium. The black ships did not just open harbors, they opened cracks. In society, a breakdown of consensus began. Some believed the country should modernize, adopt new technologies, an army, an economy. Others, that barbarians should be expelled, honor restored, and a return to original purity achieved. Slogans emerged that became symbolic. Sono joy, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. These words were spoken with fervor, with despair, with the hope of returning to the beginning. But a return was no longer possible. The shogunate tried to reform itself. Specialists in Western sciences were invited. Translations of books began. Military schools were founded. But time was short. Trust was undermined. Peasant uprisings became more frequent. Samurai, dissatisfied with the government, began to form radical groups. Some attacked foreigners, others their own people. In the cities, tension grew. In Kyoto, courtiers became active, demanding the return of real power to the emperor. A confrontation became inevitable. The symbolic center of the nation, the emperor, began to resonate again as a source of legitimacy. Around him gathered groups of young samurai from the Satsuma and Choshu clans, southern and western provinces. These provinces, far from the center, had preserved military strength and political ambition. They were to become the vanguard of what would go down in history as the Meiji Restoration. In 1867, the last shogun of the Tokugawa clan, Yoshinobu, formally abdicated. He hoped to preserve his positions by symbolically yielding to the emperor. But the following year, war broke out. The armies of the clans confronted the remnants of the shogunate. Battles took place in Kyoto, Osaka, and the northern provinces. The war was short. Kamakura did not revive. Edo surrendered without a fight. Emperor Mutsuhito moved to Edo, and the city received a new name, Tokyo, meaning Eastern Capital. This is the end of the Edo period. It had everything: peace, coercion, form, beauty, unfreedom, and persistence. But its structure could not withstand contact with change. It did not collapse from the outside. It crumbled from within, because it had held its breath for too long. Now the country began to breathe anew. In this breath there was fear, but also energy. The Meiji era began, and with it, a new definition of Japan. Not as islands in the fog, but as a state seeking its place in the world. Silence was replaced by a hum. In the city where samurai with 2 swords once strode through the streets, a train now ran. It moved on tracks that hadn't existed 10 years before. The air was filled with the smell of coal, metal, steam. It was the sound of a new era. The Meiji era began not with the thunder of revolution, but with the grinding of machines, the rustle of the Constitution's paper, the first printed newspapers. The young Emperor Mutsuhito, sitting on the throne in Kyoto and soon in Tokyo, did not yet speak aloud. But in his name, changes occurred that were unparalleled in earlier Japanese history. The new government, composed of former samurai from the southern principalities of Satsuma, Choshu, and Tosa, built the country like a mechanism. Every cog in it had to be in place. A cabinet of ministers, a ministry of the army, a ministry of education, police, and justice were created. In place of the old clans, new elites. In place of clan loyalty, loyalty to the state. The idea of the nation, as a body in which everyone must function, became the new religion. Education became compulsory. Children, whether from a fishing village in Hokkaido or a shop in Osaka, sat at school desks. They learned hieroglyphs, arithmetic, hymns about love for the emperor, and poems about the sunrise. Teachers wore black uniforms. In schools, order, discipline, chemistry, and gymnastics resonated. Girls learned to sew and sing, boys to march and calculate. All this to be part of the whole. In parallel, the army developed. It no longer depended on the clan. Now, every young man upon reaching 20 years of age was subject to conscription. Soldiers marched according to European regulations. Officers wore Prussian uniforms. During exercises, rifles and artillery were used. This was not just a new military order. It was an education of the body, will, and discipline. And with that, the birth of the notion of strength as a source of respect. The fleet, built with the help of British specialists, grew faster. Then it could be put into service. The waters around the archipelago were no longer just a border. They became a corridor of movement, of possible influence. Japan looked at the map and saw not only itself. It saw a world long divided among colonial powers. It saw China, weakened by internal conflicts. It saw Korea, squeezed between the interests of Russia and China. And it began to ask, if not now, then when? In 1894, Japan entered into war with China. The pretext was the struggle for influence in Korea. But behind it was more, the desire to show that the country, which had undergone the fastest modernization in the world, was ready for recognition. The Japanese army acted decisively, organized, with precise logistics and iron will. The Chinese army, still shackled by corruption and outdated structures, retreated. The war ended with the signing of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Japan received Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, and influence in Korea. This was the first victory of a new power. The world took notice, but with attention came suspicion. Russia, Germany, and France demanded that Japan give up part of the terms. Japan yielded, outwardly calmly, but inwardly with resentment. This feeling would later be called Sangoku Kanshoku, the triple humiliation. It would not be forgotten. It would become motivation. This was followed by a new wave of modernization. The army became even stronger. The economy even more export-oriented. The construction of railways, shipyards, and steel mills began. Large family corporations, zaibatsu, such as Mitsubishi and Sumitomo, received state support and became pillars of industrialization. Workers toiled in factories, women in weaving mills. 8 hours, 6-day week, black bread and boiling. Water. Their labor. That was the engine of the empire. But not only machines drove the country, ideas too. The formation of a national identity began. Anthems, flags, school rituals were created. The cult of the emperor became almost religious. His image, not as a man, but as the embodiment of the nation. In textbooks, he is the source of light. In poetry, the Father. In the army, God. This was not coercion. This was an inner framework into which everyone fit. Thus, not just a state, but an impulse was formed. It was directed forward. It knew no fatigue. It fed on ambition, and it was ready for the next step. In 1904, war with Russia began. Japan challenged one of the largest empires in the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, when Europe had not yet experienced its first global catastrophe, and the world was in a balance of great powers, Japan did something unexpected. It entered into war with the Russian Empire. It was a battle for Korea and Manchuria, but much more. A battle for recognition. In February 1904, Japanese ships attacked the Russian squadron at Port Arthur. Without declaration, without hesitation. It was a cold strategic calculation, and at the same time, a demonstration that Japan was no longer a student. The war was harsh. On land, in Manchuria, in the trenches, in the rain, on snow-covered passes. At sea, off the Tsushima Strait, where the Japanese fleet under Ivry, the command of Admiral Togo crushed the Russian Pacific Fleet. This was an event of global significance. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power defeated a European empire. The world applauded, watched, but also grew suspicious. In 1905, the Treaty of Portsmouth was signed. Japan received southern Sakhalin, control over Korea, and railways in Manchuria, and most importantly, the feeling of its maturity. However, victory also had its shadow. Unrest broke out within the country. People expected more, both territories and compensation. Demonstrations, strikes, and clashes with the police began. This was the first massive social protest in New Japan. It resonated. The state is not only the army and glory, it is also the people and their expectations. In the following decades, the country continued to grow. Industry developed rapidly. Textiles, metallurgy, shipbuilding. The urban population increased. New professions emerged: engineers, accountants, journalists. Universities were built, new theaters opened, film studios appeared. An urban culture also emerged: cafeterias, magazines, Western-style fashion. Men wore suits, women, dresses, or modernized kimonos. Secular music, dances, and street newspapers appeared. Tokyo became a metropolis. Osaka, an industrial center. Yokohama, a world port. But with modernization, tension also grew. Japan remained a country with a rigid social hierarchy. Peasants lived in poverty. Workers suffered from a lack of rights. Trade unions emerged, but with difficulty. The samurai code became a myth, but not a solution. People sought a new foundation and found it in the idea of the nation. Nationalism grew louder and louder. School, army, press, everything emphasized Japan's uniqueness, its mission, its special path. And all this against the backdrop of international recognition. After World War I, in which Japan participated on the side of the Entente, seizing German colonies in the Pacific and Shandong, its status rose. In 1919, it was one of the victors. At the Paris Peace Conference, its delegation sought recognition of the principle of racial equality, but was refused. This again caused a feeling of offense. Japan, civilized, industrial, strong, but still in the eyes of the West, different. In the 1920s, democratization began. It was a period that would be called Taisho democracy. Parties formed in parliament. Women began to fight for their rights. The press became bolder. In the cities, Marxist circles, liberal clubs, and modernist literary salons emerged. It seemed that Japan was seeking a balance between West and East, between imperial order and freedom. But this freedom was fragile. In 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake occurred. It destroyed Tokyo and Yokohama, claiming hundreds of thousands of lives. In a panic, pogroms, suspicions, and xenophobia began. Fear became a new shadow. The economy faltered. Inflation, unemployment, growing discontent, and then the Great Depression. It hit Japan in the late 1920s, forcing banks to close, businesses to go bankrupt, and millions to lose their jobs. Against this backdrop, the voices of the military grew louder and louder. The army, which still considered itself the guardian of the nation, began to interfere in politics. Young officers spoke of spiritual rebirth, of the need for expansion, of Japan being not just islands, but an idea. Nationalism became a tool. The idea of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere began to form not as a theory, but as a plan. In the next section, the beginning of militarization, the invasion of China, preparations for the World War, and the trials the country will endure in the shadow of fire. The early 1930s brought not only economic difficulties, but also a shift in consciousness. The military, especially army circles, began to feel that they were the true bearers of the Japanese idea. Compromises did not suit them. The weakness of parliament, subordination to Western diplomacy, internal discord, all this displeased them. They sought an enemy and, at the same time, meaning. In this search, their gaze turned north, towards China. In 1931, in Manchuria, the Japanese army, on its own initiative and without the knowledge of the government, orchestrated an incident on the railway. This was a pretext. Within a few weeks, all of Manchuria came under control. A puppet regime, Manchukuo, was created, with the last Chinese emperor Puyi as its nominal ruler. This was not just a territorial acquisition, it was a new way of thinking. The army acted as a state within a state. The international community condemned this. The League of Nations conducted an investigation. In response, Japan withdrew from the organization. Isolation intensified, but within the country, the army gained new weight. Its actions, portrayed as restoring order and protecting Japan's interests, found support in society. The militarization of everyday life began. In schools, heroism was taught. In newspapers, bravery was written about. In cinema, soldiers were shown as role models. The military uniform became part of the street scene. Political assassinations, coup attempts, the closure of the liberal press. All this occurred in parallel with the strengthening of patriotic rituals. The emperor now became not just a symbol, but a living god. His portrait hung in every classroom. Before him, people bowed. His name could not be uttered without reverence. People felt they were not just citizens, they were part of a great mission. In 1937, the Japanese army invaded central China. A full-scale war began. It quickly engulfed Shanghai, Nanjing, Hankou. In Nanjing, what would later be called the massacre occurred. Mass killings, violence, destruction. This became a trauma and a shame that would be discussed, silenced, and re-exposed for decades. But within the country, the war was portrayed as liberation. Posters, songs, school essays, everything spoke of justice. Industry switched to military production. Tanks, airplanes, and rifles were produced. People lived on ration cards, everything for the front. And with this, slogans about a new Asia, free from Western colonies, united under Japan's spiritual leadership, resonated more and more often. Meanwhile, diplomatic isolation intensified. Japan drew closer to Germany and Italy. In 1940, the Tripartite Pact was signed. This became preparation for entry into World War II. The USA, Great Britain, and the Netherlands began to impose sanctions, particularly painful, the blockade of oil supplies. And without oil, the army cannot move. The fleet becomes vulnerable. And then the decision is made: strike first. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese planes attacked the American base at Pearl Harbor. This was the beginning of the war in the Pacific. Japan captured the Philippines, Malaya, Indonesia, and Burma. Its army stretched for thousands of kilometers, but the wider the front, the harder it is to hold. And American industry unleashed its full power. The first defeats began in 1942. The Battle of Midway, Guadalcanal, island after island. By the end of the war, Japan was bombed daily. Cities burned. Tokyo engulfed in flames. Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka lost tens of thousands of lives. But the government did not give up. The emperor remained silent. People continued to work, evacuate children, dig trenches, write poems about cherry blossoms, and then August. On the 6th, Hiroshima. On the 9th, Nagasaki. Explosions the world had not known. Light that blinds memory. Shadows left on walls. Air that cannot be breathed. A sight that cannot be endured. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito spoke on the radio for the first time. His voice, quiet, faltering. He admitted defeat. Japan surrendered. After the emperor's words, broadcast on broken radio waves, silence fell. In that silence, there was no triumph, only realization. Cities lay in ashes, millions homeless, portraits of the fallen, in altars under maple branches. The country, which had dreamed of a great future, found itself at ground zero. And this was not just a military defeat. It was the destruction of the foundation, of faith in the infallibility of the path, in the righteousness of power, in the uniqueness of the spirit. The American occupation began almost immediately. General Douglas MacArthur landed in Tokyo and led the process of demilitarization and reforms. But this was not an occupation as subjugation. It was a new order. The first step was disarmament. The army disbanded. Factories reoriented. The samurai sword, which had endured for centuries, went to the museum. Then, a new constitution. Adopted in 1947, it declared Japan a democratic country. What mattered was no longer origin, but rights. The emperor was retained, but as a symbol, not as a deity. He remained, but was silent. And in that silence lay much: dignity, shame, the beginning of something new. Freedom of speech, assembly, and the press were proclaimed. Women gained the right to vote. In schools, militaristic, education was abolished. In universities, humanities, psychology, and sociology began to be taught. They spoke of man, not as a cog, but as a personality. The economy was in ruins, but aid from the USA and the mobilization of internal resources provided the impetus. Large corporations were restructured. Investments in light industry, then in heavy industry, began. People worked from dawn to dusk, not out of coercion, out of a desire to rebuild themselves. Workers got up at 5 in the morning, rode factory buses, women prepared bento lunches, children proudly wore school uniforms, everything so that the country could get back on its feet. Culturally, a reinterpretation began. Writers wrote not about heroes, but about pain. Kobo Abe, Osamu Dazai, Yukio Mishima, each sought a form to express the post-catastrophic reality. In cinema, Kurosawa made films about honor, but not as an ideal, but as destructible and restorable matter. In music, both classical forms, and American jazz, and newly discovered Japanese folk resonated. In the streets, new buildings began to appear. Reinforced concrete, glass, straight lines, architecture, no longer an imitation of the temple. It became a testament to strength. There was television, household appliances, refrigerators. What was once unattainable became commonplace. Japan entered a comfort zone, for the first time not through military expansion, but through quality. And yet, the pain did not disappear. People did not talk about the war. Those who returned from the front remained silent. Those who had lost kept portraits. Those who were born after asked questions. This silence was not oblivion. It was a form of respect. Not to scream does not mean to betray. In 1952, after the signing of the San Francisco Peace Treaty, the occupation ended. Japan became independent again, but different, without an army, without ambitions, with a new constitution, with a new outlook. It no longer sought to dominate. It began to listen. The country that once dictated terms now learned to build equal relationships. It became a supplier of technology, culture, and quality. But most importantly, it became a space for quiet experience. This is precisely what made Japan of the second half of the 20th century special. It had no strength. It had persistence. It had no expansion. It had balance. People lived, not with a sword, but with a pen, with a flower, with a stone in the garden. They built, not for show, but for silence. And this silence became the most lasting victory. The spring of 2011 brought not the wind of cherry blossoms, but black water. On March 11th, Japan was shaken by an earthquake, the most powerful in the country's history. The underground waves, born off the coast of Tohoku, triggered a tsunami that, dozens of meters high, crashed down on cities and villages. Trains disappeared, underwater. Houses were swept away like paper. People fled, unable to take anything. And then, silence. But not peace. At the Fukushima nuclear power plant, an accident occurred. Electricity disappeared. The reactors overheated. Radioactive emissions escaped into the air and sea. It was a shock, not because of the fury of nature, which is common in Japan, but because what seemed controllable was so fragile. The country, built on technology, felt. Technology is not a panacea. People are not masters. After Fukushima, questions that had previously been silenced began to be asked. About energy, about sustainability, about vulnerability. In schools, they began to talk about safety not as statistics, but as care. In kitchens, about frugality, not as sacrifice, but as wisdom. In newspapers, about the balance between strength and attention. But at the same time, Japan showed itself. Calm queues at water distribution points. People bowing when receiving bread. Power plant workers taking risks to stop emissions. No one screamed. No one accused. Everyone worked, supported, went deep to pull out the future. After that, the country began to switch to new energy sources. Much was said about green transformation, about waste disposal, about reuse. Architects began to design earthquake-resistant houses, streets wider, with evacuation points, people more attentive. This was not fear. This was respect. Culture continued to flourish in these years. Anime and manga became not just a genre, but a system of thought. The films of Miyazaki, Shinkai, Hosoda do not tell stories. They create space where one can linger, where one can feel the rain on the glass, where one can cry and not be ashamed. In these worlds, time flows like a river, slowly but precisely. Music, from traditional shamisen to Sakamoto's minimalist compositions, creates a sense of depth. Even in pop culture, there is silence. Bands perform, but do not scream. Audiences listen, but do not demand. It is a strange but whole world, where everything can be very different, but does not fall apart. Within the country, the demographic challenge is increasingly felt. The population is shrinking. Schools are closing. In the villages, 5 children. The elderly are becoming the majority. This is not a crisis. This is a new form of life. Silence on the trains. A slow step at the crossing. A shop whose owner is 90 years old. Everything works, but does not rush. Japan does not save itself through growth. It seeks depth. It creates robots that care for the elderly, develops interfaces that do not frighten, sets up kiosks where an elderly person can pay for electricity, send a letter, and buy soup. This is not technology for technology's sake. This is technology for care, and therein lies the essence of a country that is not afraid to age, that knows how to do little, but precisely, that knows that between beginning and end there is no victory. There is only a path, and this path is not a line, it is a circle. At the beginning of the 21st century, Japan stands apart. It is not the strongest power, not the most populous. Its economy is no longer the first, nor even the second. Its army exists, but does not fight. Its politics are restrained. But at the same time, when one speaks of it, the voice becomes quieter, because it reminds, there is another way. One can be quiet. One can be precise. One can be long. In Tokyo, millions of people. The subway arrives in seconds. The doors open precisely on time. But inside, no one speaks. Everyone looks out the window, at a book, at a screen. This is not detachment. This is respect. Everyone has their own space, and no one violates yours. In a village on Shikoku, 70 inhabitants. The elders grow tea, teach the young to weave paper, hold festivals in the rain, not for tourists, for themselves. There, children walk across a bridge made of vines. There is no supermarket, but there is light in the window and daikon soup. Japan is not a balance between past and future. It is a form in which the past becomes a backdrop, and the future, not a goal, but a possibility. The country continues to create driverless trains, robots that serve tea, satellites that take photos of the Earth. But it does not lose. Buddhist temples, shrines with torii gates, a teacup with a crack, filled with gold. It is precisely the crack and not the smooth surface that becomes the image of Japanese wisdom. It teaches the ideal is fragile and the imperfect lives. The art of kintsugi, to restore what is broken, emphasizing the scar, is not aesthetics. It is a philosophy. Accept, repair, leave a trace. In Japanese culture, there is no word goodbye in the literal sense. They usually say, let's be together again. This is hope. This is respect for repetition. Because life is not a one-time event. It is a rhythm. In it, not the finale is important, but the breath. Not the result, but the presence. That is precisely why Japan remains for the world the place where one can stop, where one can learn not to shout, where one can see the plum blossom in January, how leaves fall one by one, how the sound of a bell is carried away by the wind, 1,000 years of history, not a chronology. It is a voice. It does not demand attention. It does not call to battle. It simply walks alongside. And if you listen carefully, you can hear the silence resonating within it. And in that silence is Japan. Thank you for being on this journey. Good night.